Hello, I'm Allan Hunter. I'm the co-director of the Glasgow Film Festival, and I just want to thank you for having watched Iorram, Boat Song. I hope you watched it on as big a screen as you could with the best sound that was available to you. And I'm very pleased that we're now joined by the film's producer, Adam Dawtrey, and the director, Alastair Cole. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome back to the festival, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good to have you back, and congratulations on the film. Alastair, I wondered if you might want to start by telling us something about this amazing audio archive and the extent of it, how you came to explore it and draw inspiration from it.
Yeah, I mean, the film, as you would have seen, is based around this extraordinary repository of sound archive that, it sits in the School of Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh. It's part of the School of Scottish Studies archives, but really it's based around incredible fieldwork that was done in from the 1940s onwards, and it was done by remarkable people that when sound recording really started first getting introduced, portable sound recording got introduced. People went with microphones to the Outer Hebrides, and they collected both for language sake to capture the language, but also the stories and the traditions and a lot of the things you would have just heard. But it was done, I suppose, from an academic perspective as well. They were ethnographers, and they were collecting a huge amount of material. So it made for a very remarkable archive. And the extent of it, I mean, what you see, what we had to work with was around 30,000 clips that were just in Gaelic. But the extent of the archive, it goes well beyond that. And that archive also includes remarkable material from all around Scotland. And it's totally worth checking out. And you can find that on a big chunk of it online, because it has been digitalized. And I suppose that's the point that we arrived at. The real work around all that archive has happened over 10 or 15 years before now, in a really remarkable digitalization process, because the material originally is on wire recording, it's on tape recording, there were shellac recordings that Kana House Archive had that were amazing. And so they come with the history of the material that were filmed. So, for sound geeks like me, it's a fun thing as well. But as a piece of history, it's really a remarkable project that I think deserves, the reason this film can happen is because of the work that's happened before me, and by the archivists and the people that have just dedicated huge amounts of time, and that then came on board and to this project and supported this.
And how did you decide to take the approach that you do of using archive material with contemporary footage? I mean, did you consider other options? Did you consider using archive film, or going a kind of expensive Peter Jackson alchemy route, something like that? Or
yeah, it was. Yeah, we were making the film when Peter Jackson's film came out, so it was an interesting one to see at the time, which is well worth seeing if anyone hasn't. But it was, it was a creative decision, and it was a creative limitation that I put on myself early on in this project. And it was something that the heart of this project was for me, I was doing research in the islands, and I was really inspired by sort of what you see it there. You get charmed by the Outer Hebrides. So if anyone's been there, I don't need to explain that. But seeing the history and the places and the people, but also realizing that it's all tied up in the language was really part of that. And I wanted to find a way to explore this relationship between the sea and fishing and the language. And then realizing what the scope of the archive was, it was really a creative decision that, at the time I was working with an academic called Magnus Kors, who's a co-producer on the film and works at the University of Edinburgh. And we were driving up to that Hebrides, and we just sort of said, what if we gave ourselves the restriction of just using sound archive and visual archive? And it made me think as a filmmaker that maybe this is, people have worked with sound archive before in different ways, but a conscious restriction may give us something here to give a contemporary meaning to that archive, and to make those links, to make that link between the past and the present, which was really at the heart of this project. How do you make that link, and how do we see the present today in the context of this incredible history that, over 1,000 years of history of the language. And this was, it was a leap of faith by everyone to get involved, because we did a proof of concept to see if this could work initially, as opposed to a kind of teaser or something, because we just weren't that sure if it would, but we think it did, and it was really thanks to the creative team that came on board that had the faith in some ways to get involved.
I mean, Adam, this does feel like it's a one of a kind sort of film. So was there a pitch for this, or how do you actually make it happen?
Al's pitch to me was sending me the proof of concept, and that was then, I mean, it was really a very simple equation. You know, we kind of looked each other in the eyes early on and said, there's only two entities that are going to support this. That's BBC Alba and Screen Scotland. And we go to them and we sell the idea to them, and they either get it or they don't. And we were incredibly fortunate, really, that we found our way in pretty easily to see Margaret Mary Murray at BBC Alba, and we, you know, pressed play, and she started laughing straight away. And weirdly, I don't think we'd thought of it as funny particularly either. So, you know, and we're not Gaelic speakers, either of us. So to show that to her and to get that response was amazing. And so from then on, we were doing it. And you know, we say it's, we believe and we say it's the first ever documentary entirely in Scottish Gaelic. And that was not something we had realized until we'd made it, actually, and that comes from the fact, this decision to make it entirely from the archive. Because if you went and filmed an observational documentary in the Western Isles, the Outer Hebrides today, there is no way that somebody wouldn't speak English to you at some point, if not most of the time. And so it was an accident. It wasn't how we didn't set out to make the first ever, you know, documentary entirely in Scottish Gaelic, but we realized we'd done it and checked around and couldn't quite believe it. And we had a lot of Gaelic consultants on the project who are very familiar with every single word of Gaelic that's ever been uttered in any film, like the 3 words that are in Braveheart and whatever. And they went, no, it's never been done. So, you know, we kind of hadn't quite realized how groundbreaking this was. But of course, that's all of a piece with the fundamental story and subject of the film, which is all around language and the persistence of language and how you translate from one linguistic culture to another one, you know, in the current 21st century environment.
And as you're developing this, it's a very basic question, but does image come first and sound second, or do you have, there's lots of lovely things here, stories that I want to use, and we're going to find something that kind of seems to match that? Or is it just you start shooting and you see where you go?
Yeah, I mean, we work with a Scottish editor called Colin Money, who, you know, I'm sure you know his work, and other, he's worth looking up as a really great, you know, editor of both documentary and fiction film. But fortunately, Colin also has his family are in Gaelic education, so he had a connection to the Gaelic world, and I suppose we sat down and I showed him this proof of concept, and he again was generously enthusiastic and came on board the project. And it was a matter of him and I sitting down. I'd been filming for a couple of years by this point, so I had a big kind of collection of material all the time I was going through the archive. So that the sort of first 2 years of development were really done me alone and working with Magnus Course at the University of Edinburgh. And we were in a fortunate position because of the academic support to do the research for this sort of project, because just purely going through that archive, getting your head around what's there and sending off hours and hours and hours to subtitlers to send back rushes to be subtitled was sort of how we had to get to grips with it. And it was the early edit. So the early first month or two of the edit was really about the sound. So our approach was we knew what the visual material we had was to an extent, sort of 80% of it. And I had shot the whole time while listening to the archive, thinking there might be connections here, there might be connections there. But when we really started sitting down to edit, it was the sound first, and we wanted to get that working, and then and start piecing those images together. But the first paper edit of this film was a sound edit, and then we made the obvious connections, the scenes that we knew would really work. And then there was a lot of alchemy that had to happen. Someone like Colin's great with alchemy because he's, you know, an experienced editor, can see things and understand an audience well before, you know, a filmmaker might expect. And I think understanding how someone might respond to that was a testing game, much more so than any other editor I've been involved, that you really had to see it work in front of you before you got, you know, the links that were there. And a lot of them were very metaphoric and very seeing things in the images or hearing things or understanding that we may need to add some sound to pull out more meaning. But it was sound sound first, knowing the visuals we had, and then I got sent back away to get all the extra material that we needed, and I was back in the islands for the next couple of years, finishing that, or the next year, sorry, it was, from the time we started editing, and just getting the final pieces of the puzzle to come together. But it was, sorry.
One of the interesting things, if I could butt in, because there was not that much action in the material that Al had shot, and there was one piece that from early on, Al and Colin were going, yeah, but we've got this sequence where there's a trawler and they pull up this huge rock and it's really dramatic, and they're, and they were showing it to me. I was going, yeah, it's okay. There's something going on there. But actually, when it ended up being cut into the film, it was almost out of sync with what was going on in the rest of the film. I mean, that sequence is still there, but it's much more reduced than I think Al, when you say it's right, we originally thought it would be. We thought it would be, I think, probably a much bigger sequence, but somehow it didn't suit the lyrical, contemplative style of the film to have something actually going on in front of your eyes, because the action is in your ears, really.
Yeah, it is that shift between like having the audience lead with their ears, the way they listen in a way. And that sequence, I mean, it's one of these classic things, the documentary filmmaker. I was there on the trawler. I thought I was going to die. So I, when you're on the trawler, when things are exciting happening to you, it's to have them sit within a film. It takes on a very different context, and how that was cut is different. But it adds an important moment to the film, but it does sit in contrast to the rest of the material that we found really worked. And it was the emotions that came through and from the archive that gave other meaning to the images, but also at the same time the images were able to give us contemporary meaning to a lot of that archive that we thought really surprised us, but was really a joy to edit in a lot of ways.
I guess the emotional impact of the film is almost quite surprising, because there's all these kind of ghosts from the past that are kind of coming back to life almost, and feel as real as somebody who's alive, and yet they're 70 years ago or more or whatever when they were recorded. And it kind of just lends a real poignancy and a sense of what fishing meant to the community, how many lives were employed in it, and just the personal stories as well of, like, we were up at 4 a.m. to start at 6 a.m, and you're like, blimey, that sort of brings home quite how hard and tough a life it was. And is that what struck you immediately, the kind of poignancy in that, and the kind of immediate kind of emotional connection it gives you to the material?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the nature of that archive, is because it was done by ethnographers for a reason of capturing everything and anything. And they, there was a lot of really wonderful off-mic conversations that we managed to catch, and to capture a portrait of the islands as well. But I suppose the important thing for us early on was we didn't want to embalm these voices. We wanted them to be living today in a way through what you're seeing. So to have that everyday conversation, that it hasn't, a lot of things haven't changed. The fishing industry is still a vital part of life in the islands, and the cultural life of the islands as well, and the linguistic life of the islands, importantly. So to have that connection was important, but also to have the everyday, because it was charming and the stuff was fascinating. And there were so many things that we would have included, so many songs we would have loved to include that we weren't able to, but they were brilliant. And it was going through that archive outside of this film is a real joy. And it does, I think, bring us home to what Scotland has. And it's a real value to Scotland, I think, that archive, but so many sound archives that are out there that maybe aren't as explored as enough.
There was one sequence that we really, really, really wanted to have in the film, where this old woman, I assume she was an old woman, was telling a funny story to her friends, and they were screaming with laughter. But it was based around a strange, garbled mistranslation of English to Gaelic, back to Gaelic. The joke, that they were understanding was about trying to speak English but speaking it badly, and there was just no way that we could make it make sense to in the subtitles. And we just wanted the laughter on the soundtrack, didn't we? But we just couldn't get the story in a form that anybody who wasn't an old Gaelic woman could understand.
Yeah, it was interesting because we had this really great. That clip was interesting because we had a really great team of consultants and people supporting us, an amazing sort of lead translator, a woman called Jo McKenzie, led the linguistic side of it. But you would send out a clip like that to everyone to really feedback. And I think with one of them, the closest we got to getting an understanding through the entire Gaelic community was that the people that were getting recorded were kind of having a joke about the recordists themselves. And that was as close. So it was fantastic to hear, but you couldn't really convey that through. But there was that many layers to a lot of that audio that it was tough, but it was great fun to go through. And like I said, it's a remarkable repository.
I love the sense of pride that comes through so often of like, the herring and Baron are the best in the world, or when they're sort of saying, these English landladies, they didn't know how to cook food that the Scots could.
They didn't know.
That comes through really strongly. I really like that.
Probably true, no?
Yeah, well, absolutely wouldn't at all, of course. What was both of you's kind of relationship with the sea and the islands before? I mean, do you sail? Do you fish? Has this kind of changed your lives in any way, making this film?
I mean, I grew up at the sea, but I grew up in New Zealand, as you may or may not have guessed. Listening to that, but I've been in Scotland 15 years, and the Outer Hebrides specifically, have been from very on my time here. Have been I don't know whether it's because it reminds me of home a little bit, but of New Zealand. But there is there's an element of the stories of the sea that fascinated me for a long time, and fishing does, and that community. But it's language that I came to this from. My background, and from my previous films, I'm really fascinated about this relationship, subjects about language and society and culture. So that's kind of the first entry point. But as a New Zealander growing up at the sea, then you maybe at least you can have steady enough feet on the boats to be out there.
Adam?
Well, no, never been there. Want to go there. I think if it hadn't been for lockdown and making the film during lockdown, I would have been. We were planning on going up to Stornoway at one point and asking around where to go. It's made me much more interested in Gaelic, I have to say. I mean, I was introduced to Saudie MacLean through this film, and I love poetry, and I love the poetry of this language. I think that's the thing I found when I was first watching all the stuff that Al was showing me, was it was kind of reminiscent of watching a Scandinavian film. It had that same sort of intriguing lyrical, like I don't know the language, but hearing it is really important. I think even if you don't speak the language, being able to hear it clearly, I mean, that was sometimes a debate we had even in the sound edit, is that I want to be able to hear the words in Gaelic as I read them in English. There was just being able to just have a feel for what that language, the sort of emotional soundscape of that language is so extraordinary. And I obviously through this, you can just scratch the surface of that. So for me, I suppose, if there's anything, it's really, rather than just thinking kind of, why does it say that on the train signs underneath the English bit that I understand, that we're all familiar with, is actually, this is an incredibly rich thing that's just under our noses. And most people in Scotland still have no relationship with, let alone I'm from England, So, understanding the richness of that language culture is fascinating, and is something I would love to know more about.
And who had the inspired notion of bringing on Aiden O'Rourke to contribute music?
So I'm a big fan of Lau, and early on, I think I even edited the proof of concept to some Lau tunes, and that was also how I won over Aiden, because I showed him that with his own music on it, but it was. He is a remarkable musician, I think, in contemporary folk music in Scotland, and he is from Oban, and he understood that world very well. But also musically, he pushes boundaries, and him and his group Lau, but also as a solo musician, he pushes boundaries. And I always thought that both Lau and Aiden, it was surprising to me that they hadn't done a feature score yet. They hadn't done a film score. Aiden hadn't, this was his first big score, and the music is so cinematic, and it is so, deep, and there's a lot of layers to what's going on, and it is very traditional but very contemporary as well. So it did what we were trying to do with this film, to combine this past and the contemporary. And Aiden has been a wonderful collaborator on this, and the making of the soundtrack has been very creative and interesting in a way, because it wasn't about finishing a film and giving him it to work on. We worked collaboratively with it. So he was involved in the process from early on. He sort of was on board basically before we started editing. And then, Colin Money had edited a film called From Scotland with Love with King Creosote, the soundtrack. And we borrowed a lot from the process of that there was a lot of collaboration from a rough cut stage. So Aiden was seeing very early versions and responding to them, and we were able to respond to the music. And that was always conceived of as, the music was conceived of as really important to be in conversation with the sound archive. And that was where we really realized it was working, was when Aiden was scoring to the songs that were sung in a kitchen in Stornoway in 1940. That was where it really worked. And we realized we had something remarkable, even though, poor Aiden had to sort of change key 5 times during a piece to go with the archive. But he put a brilliant bunch of musicians on, and I think the score is going to come out. It's going to be released later in the year, and as a standalone piece of music, it's remarkable. And his contribution, and lockdown was very beneficial for us, because Aiden was maybe able to spend a lot more time on it than he would have otherwise been able to. But he wholeheartedly got involved, and that's all you can sort of ask from a creative collaborator, to really believe in it. And I think it created a really, bringing the film that it was a joy for us.
And I was thinking, over the last few weeks, I think consequences of Brexit and the impact on the fishing industry in Scotland have become kind of glaringly obvious to everyone. And do you feel there's some strange connection between the film and what we're seeing in the fishing industry, in terms of, a glimpse into what we have and what we've lost, and what existed and what still exists, and it somehow seems to chime in all of that somewhere?
Yeah, I suppose that it comes back to the original research that I was involved with, that talks about this a lot, the importance of Gaelic to the fishing industry and the fishing industry to Gaelic, and they come hand in hand. And we had looked at this film to be released last year, and thinking it would lead into this Brexit period when maybe it was going to be an issue. When things started to time as the way they are, that also has meant our release plans change, because this film does, we think, really fit into that conversation, to say, right now the Scottish fishing industry is, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of numbers at stake that get thrown around. There's, we hear about the livelihoods, economies, which is important, but there's also a lot more. It's beyond the numbers. It is the cultural and linguistic element that is tied up within that impact side of this project was in some ways the starting point. So it's very fast. It's lovely for us for it to come back around, and it's fortuitous, the timing, but equally unfortunate, because the situation that the fishermen in the film find themselves in now is really tough. I'm in touch with them a lot around the film release, and they've seen it, and they really liked it. But as of the last 12 months has been the hardest 12 months of a lot of their lives. And before Brexit happened, lockdown was really tough for them, and it hasn't gotten easier. And so remembering that, up to 75% of the inshore fishermen in the Outer Hebrides speak Gaelic. It's one of the last industries where Gaelic is really a language of work. And it's well, as well as the livelihoods and numbers there's a cultural and linguistic element that's really tied up and important.
The film itself documents a substantial change. One of the, historically over the last century, one of my first questions to Al when he showed me the first cut is, where are all the fish? All we're seeing is, they're talking about fish all the time, but all we're seeing is shellfish, is lobsters, and I said, that's the point. They don't fish any. There are none. It's only bycatch. Now that change has happened in the last 50 to 70 years. So you've already seen a huge change. While there's this continuity in the culture, a huge change in the industry. And as Al says, right at the heart of this film is this idea that the future of the Gaelic language is totally tied up in the islands with the future of the fishing industry, because it is really the only public forum in which Gaelic is the language that people speak to each other. Otherwise, they're in their homes or in the pubs, but it's a private language apart from that, and otherwise business is done in English. And so there's a lot at stake here beyond obviously the very significant issue of people's immediate livelihoods.
Yeah, sure. And where does the film go from here? What are the plans for it? Depending on changing circumstances, obviously.
Well, we want, after we've been with your lovely festival for a few days, we're going on general release again virtually, for the coming weeks in the UK. So people will be able to see it through their local cinemas online. Internationally, we are hoping to roll out, later in the year, particularly in places like Canada. Where, as you know, is the only other country where there's an indigenous Gaelic-speaking population up in Nova Scotia. Australia and New Zealand. We've already had a lot of response from, the Rocky Mountains, from the United States, where there are sort of strong pockets of Scottish culture. Of course, this isn't a film. We deliberately see this film as a film reaching out to non-Gaelic speakers. It's not a Gaelic film for a Gaelic audience, though we of course it's for them, but it's one to talk to other people about Gaelic and about Gaelic culture. So really, we see a lot of interest from similar communities in the Basque Country, in Galicia, in Brittany, in Wales, in Cornwall. We think there's a lot to resonate with people. And then, since you mentioned Aiden, we're talking about that earlier. I think here in the UK, when cinemas reopen, we always had in mind that we could do this with live performance. We wanted to do it with you, but that turned out not to be possible. But we still think there will come a point where we'll be able to do that. And I think this is the kind of film. I hope that the people who've watched it, tonight, this afternoon, and in the next few days of your festival, feel it's something that they will want to come back to, actually, because it feels to me it's that kind of work, where there's so much to immerse yourselves in, rather like listening to an album over and over again. So we think there'll be an audience for live performances in a real place, surrounded by other people. Remember that, where we can all swing along together to Aiden and his band.
Fingers crossed that proves possible at some point this year. And thank you very much. Thank you, both of you, and good luck with the film.
Thank you. Thank you to the festival for having it.